Welcome and thank you for joining us for the second half of the Factor Uncensored. Female empowerment can show up in many different ways. My next guest uses her music to make that happen. Joining us now here on the Factor Uncensored, we have with us musician SunniThaRapper. Glad to have you here on the Factor Uncensored.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Now, this is officially your second visit, right?
Yes, it is.
So, in the past, you were part of a group that many of us remember.
Yeah.
Tell us about that group.
I was in a group called Blush. Blush Music under Mr. Matthew Knowles. And yeah, we were a nationwide traveling girl group, consisted of 2 rappers and a singer. And now I'm here as a solo artist. And
what was that experience like, traveling around the country? Obviously, as an entertainer, that's something you want, to be there meeting your fans, performing live. What was that like for you? Oh, it was great. I mean, I feel like that's the reason why I am the artist that I am now as a solo artist, because I did go through artist development. I was trained. I did travel. Literally, we did a 33-city tour, radio tour, and every single stop, we was performing and rapping for somebody. So it gave me a lot of practice, media training as well. Like, it just really helped, I guess, marinate me for right now, for the time while I'm popping out the oven. As me, for real, a lot of marination. That's what you don't get a lot anymore, like the old Motown days. And that's definitely what it was like. Yeah, artist development. You know how Matthew was, and he had us outside. We rehearsed 6 to 7 hours a day. We worked out 2 to 3 before. You know, we had a full day which consisted of being an artist every day and just getting our bodies, our minds, everything together. So I really appreciate going through that. It really helped me be the artist that I am right now. That holistic approach. Definitely. Well, SunniThaRapper, I'm going to step out of the way. You're going to perform your single, Thickkk. Yes. All right.
What's up, y'all? I'm SunniThaRapper, straight out of Mo City, Texas. And this is my single, Thickkk.
Is that new SunniThaRapper?
Hey, I got thick thighs, I got thin patience. I'm a bad bitch, and I hate waiting. I got thick thighs, I got thin patience. I'm a bad bitch, and I hate waiting. I'm thick, 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 thick. I'm thick, 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 thick. I'm thick, 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 thick. I'm thick, 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 thick. Yeah, I'm possessive. Keep me a boy with some money. That thing be getting me wet. He know I'm thick. I only see him in private. Keep it small foot, we don't chat. Run up a stack. I got them thighs that clap. I'm on their head, no cap. I'm getting money. They say I'm leveling up, so you gotta match where I'm at. Post up pig, I make them sick. He wanna slap me, I'll make him live. Don't need gassing, I stay lit. I make him beg, he throwing fists. I'm on your ass, let's on the hash. Need you to eat it whenever I ask. You gotta dive in and never hold back. Baby, come focus, I'm always the task. I got thick thighs, I got thin patience. I'm a bad bitch, and I hate waiting. I got thick thighs, I got thin patience. I'm a bad bitch, and I hate waiting. I'm thick, 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 thick. 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 I'm a bad bitch, so don't try me, cola. I keep it icy, hate, but wanna be like me. Self-made, I'm the hood Kylie, name who better than me. City to city, they stop when I speak. When I call on them, they hit with speed. I am the 1 and the 2 and the 3, they don't play about me. Thickkk, I got that fatty, I got that put you to sleep in the attic. Only a few that can say they didn't have me. Don't do relations, spitting my daddy. I'm on top, they wanna pass me. Cream of the crop, I on them badly. Whipping they floppy, still I'm the baddest. They want my status, I'm causing them madness. I got thick thighs, I got thin patience. I'm a bad bitch, and I hate waiting. I got thick thighs, I got thin patience. I'm a bad bitch, and I hate waiting. I'm thick, 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 thick. 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 I know you see this big fine thing walking through, so I need all you fellas to move to the side, cause the big spine coming through. Always looking big.
Incredible, incredible. Great job, Sunny the Rapper.
Thank you.
And of course, where can we find that single?
All right, well, that single Thickkk is on all platforms. You can go ahead, all you gotta do is type in my name, SunniThaRapper, and you can find all my music on all platforms.
And for those who'd like to follow you on social media, where can they find the Thickkness?
Period. Actually, you can find it on the same. All you gotta do is remember SunniThaRapper with an I, SunniThaRapper. It'll take you to my music, my social media, everything you need.
All right, Sunny the Rapper, great job. And thank you for dropping back by the Factor Uncensored. And we will be back with more Factor in just a moment.